I'm Gerhard Kasper, the president of the American Academy, and I welcome you to what I'm sure will be an exquisite evening. We started a tradition last semester that our fellows, when they give lectures, be introduced by somebody from Berlin, could be elsewhere in Germany. And my task is, and that person will introduce the speaker, and my task is to introduce the introducer. And tonight I'm particularly pleased because normally we end up with a person who is a friend of the fellow who lectures, and that is of course perfectly wonderful and all right. Tonight, that classification is also true, but Mr. Osterwald is also a friend of the Academy and has been a friend of the Academy for a long time. He is a member of our music jury, and in the past, when he was the director of the März Musik Festival. März Musik Festival. I'm, of course, tempted to say März Music Festival. When he was the director of the März Music Festival, I won't get it. At least 4 of our fellows had their compositions performed there. He is the most remarkable thing about Mr. Osterwald is that he is, of course, like me, from Hamburg. Very important qualification. And he is now the music director of Klangspuren, a very famous contemporary music festival. And it is Klangspuren Schwarz. Schwarz is a place near Innsbruck. And if you are a Hamburgian, it sounds like black. Schwarz is without an R, of course, but Hamburgians have no R. Our R is deep down there. And so when I asked earlier, I had not heard of Schwarz as a place, and I knew of Klangspuren, but not of Schwarz. I was told that it was just pronounced the way Hamburgians say Schwarz, except without the R. We are just very, very happy to have you here tonight, and you once, when you came to Berlin, you started as the founder of Freunde guter Musik Berlin, and we are very grateful that you have remained a friend of good music to this day.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome from my side, too, to this Inga Maren Otto music talk with David Behrman in the wonderful and hospitable atmosphere of the American Academy here. And thank you very much, lieber Herr Kasper, for your kind and Hamburgian introduction of me as a person. Klangspuren Schwarz, indeed. Schwarz is a very tiny town near Innsbruck, but it used to be in late medieval times the 3rd biggest country in Austria, and it was extremely rich for silver mining. So now it has only something like 15,000 people, inhabitants. For me, it's a real great honor and pleasure to introduce David Behrman as the lecturer of tonight. He is a magnificent composer, sound and multimedia artist. He is a performer, developer, inventor, producer, and teacher. And my pleasure to introduce you, David, is even higher because we established a personal, wonderful relationship after I had a chance to work with you for the first time in '86. Being active with Freunde guter Musik, Friends of Good Music. David Behrman unfolded as a truly experimental and inventive artist after he began in the 1960s, his artistic work. Together with David Tudor and Gordon Mummer, and also the name of Jerry Hunt should be dropped here, he pioneered in the idea, and this is the really essential point, a composer built custom-made electronic circuitry and subsequently found himself in the forefront of the microcomputer music movement, which later on became so influential not only in the contemporary music scene, in the works using live electronics, but even in the rock music and techno milieus. This story, the simplified story, goes like this. The experimentalists in that time were not able to buy the circuits they needed for their compositions, so they had to design and build them by themselves at this early stage of electronic and digital technology. On this way, David helped to release computer-based music from being stuck in the cage of huge, room-sized and widely immobile big electronic studios, which were so typical for the early years of computer music. Instead, he spent his whole artistic life in programming and performing interactive works for microcomputers and live musicians, or in his installation works, interactive situations for the visitors. David had a significant and emblematic starting point in his life. He was entering the world as an early bird, as a premature baby in August 1937 in Salzburg, when his American parents visited the Salzburger Festspiele for concerts with Arturo Toscanini as a conductor. They were really big fans of him. And David luckily grew up in the sophisticated cultural atmosphere in his family. His father was a renowned playwright. His mother, Elsa Heifetz-Behrman, was the sister of the world-famous violin magician and virtuoso Jascha Heifetz, who visited the family a couple of times when David was a young boy learning violin and viola, which may have been a burden for you to have Jascha as a... After a classical music education, he became, as many of his peers, influenced by the visionary work of John Cage. And he visited 1957 and 59 the summer courses in Darmstadt, the Mecca of the European music avant-garde, where he became acquainted with the work of Pierre Boulez, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and Nam June Paik, to mention a few. He also met American avant-gardists like Terry Riley, Marianne Ameche, Frederick Chevsky, and Lamonte Young in that years. And in the 1960s, he worked as a producer in charge of the Music of Our Town series of Columbia Records, publishing some of the most influential recordings in that time. For example, Terry Riley's In C or Steve Reich's Come Out, and music by Christian Wolff, Pauline Oliveras, Mauricio Kagel, and many more important composers. 1966, he founded, together with Bob Ashley, Alvin Lucier, and Gordon Mummer, the Sonic Arts Union. By the way, most of them you found on the sheet which was under the plates. And we think, or David believes, that Bob Ashley, who is not on the photo, took the photo. You are not quite sure, but that's what you guess. In the period until 1977, this new type of an experimental avant-garde boys group toured quite successfully in North America and especially in Europe. And I expect David to focus on this dialectical relationship between European and American avant-garde. David has a long-lasting and deep relationship with Berlin. He took part in the legendary Metamusic festivals curated by Walter Bachauer back in 1974 as a member of Christian Wolff's ensemble. In 1980, he was invited by Nele Hertling and René Block to participate in the landmarking exhibition Für Augen und Ohren, for eyes and ears, with the sound installation Cloud Music. And then he was invited back for many projects in subsequent years. Another example which is important for me and some of my friends and colleagues. In May 1986, exactly 30 years ago, the curating sound artist John Driscoll and I invited David to take part in the small-scale but somehow really pioneering festival Music with Memory, which featured 4 American composers using the electronic memory in microcomputers, later called PCs or laptops, for live electronic sound processing in real time. That was, in that years, really brand new and pretty revolutionary. In 1988, David spent 1 year in Berlin as a fellow of the Berliner Künstlerprogramm of the DRD. Ingrid Beirer, who was directing this program for many years, is here tonight. Welcome, Ingrid. I do remember quite well how perplexed the jury of the program was. I was a member in that jury. Received the printout of a computer software program instead of written music on a sheet. On music sheets. It really caused turmoil, almost a revolution, and there was a big fight about that in the jury. In 2012, there was a very special moment when my colleague Volker Strebel, he's also with us here tonight, hello Volker, and I were able to reunify the Sonic Arts Tune, this boys group from the 60s and 70s, in the frame of Märzmusik Festival, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of John Cage's birth and his 10th anniversary of his death. The boys had never been together on stage since 1977, and it turned out to be the last time since, sadly, Bob Ashley died exactly 2 years ago on March 3, which is today, 2014. Let me end here with expressing my gratitude to Inga Maren Otto, who supported the music grants at the American Academy in Berlin generously for many years. And rumors whisper into my ears, this music grant will be continued for the next years to come, thanks to Mrs. Otto. David, may I invite you now to take the floor to tell us more about the musical Americans in Europe, not just an American in Paris. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and it's quite a wonderful program. This residency here is really, I think, the most wonderful residency experience that I have had. And I'm very grateful to the Academy and to President Gerhard Kasper and to you, Matthias, and to the wonderful staff here. We've been here a couple of months now, this group of fellows, and it's been really wonderful for Terry, my partner, Terry Hanlon, and I, to get to know the other fellows, and we're very fascinated by the diverse, wonderful projects that they are engaged in. Looking for my oh yeah. Oh, great. I thought, did I leave it at home? It just has to So when I was asked to give a lecture, which is the one task that we fellows have here is to give a lecture, I thought, well, what shall I do? And I thought I could talk about my own work, but I get kind of tired of sometimes of artists who are speaking about themselves. Not to put down that idea, but I recently discovered a book that I had heard about for 10 years but never knew, which is this book. It was published 10 years ago, and the author, Amy Beale, is now a professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And we know each other from various projects that we've worked on together over the past few years. And I had heard about this book for a long time, but I never read it until last fall. And when I did read it, I found that many of my friends, my former teachers, my former students, my colleagues were in her book. And it has to do with this long, in my case, very intermittent but long history of some connection between New York, between the States and Germany. So I thought, well, I'm not a scholar, and the relationship between American artists and German artists and artist producers is very complex and fascinating story, but it's too much to take on unless there were something underneath it to provide the information about it. And that I found in this book, which I really recommend. It's very well researched, very detailed, and she interviewed dozens and dozens of people, both Americans and Germans. And basically I guess you could say the gist of the story is that American artists, not just musicians, but other kinds of artists too, were developing things in the States, sometimes quite wonderful things, but they had very little support in the States. And somehow or other in Germany, in the atmosphere after World War II, the German music establishment, which was much better funded than the American one, at some point was looking for outside influences. And this benefited American artists and musicians very much over the years. In fact, it saved a number of careers. American artists who were doing things on the edge in the States and had trouble paying the rent began to have commissions and concerts and residencies in Europe. And it was, with music, it was especially in Germany, West Germany, I should say, because this all happened, actually, I'm only going to talk about the period from the 50s to the reunification, because since then the story changes and it gets different. But for years I worked with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and with that dance company it was France who saved the company. France was the country that saved the dance company. It probably would have gone out of existence in the States because there was so little support there. For some reason, it's rather mysterious, but for some reason, the style of Merce Cunningham was just very treasured in France. And serious engagements came in during the early 60s and from then on into the future. If a Cunningham run was announced in Paris, it would be immediately sold out. Every ticket would be immediately sold out. In the States, there would be maybe the first two performances would be sold out, and after that it would be half empty for the rest of the run. And these are mysterious issues. I don't know what the answer is. Why is it that Cunningham was so more valued in France than in the States? Of course, part of the story is that the arts are more valued in Europe than in the States. In fact, that's probably the answer. But in the case of musicians, it was mostly West Germany that supported the musicians from the 50s to the 80s, I think you can say, to the 90s. Well, and more recently, too. I think there were two tracks. I knew actually little about this until I read Amy's book, but there were two tracks of support. There was, early in the 20th century, apparently, there was a distinction made in West Germany between ernste Musik, serious music, and Unterhaltungsmusik, entertainment music. And apparently that distinction happened early in the century, before World War I. And then apparently in the 20s, the radio stations acquired orchestras, and the orchestras were commissioned mostly to play entertainment music. But then in the 60s, it became an issue that had classist and racial undertones, because the free jazz was considered not quite up to the level of serious music, ernste Musik. So it was put into Unterhaltungsmusik. And then perhaps my facts are not exactly right, because this is new information for me, but there was a new subcategory made in the, I believe it was in the 30s actually, gehobene Unterhaltungsmusik. And that was supposed to accommodate music that was not just entertainment, but had something going for it that seemed to be creative. Anyway, when I first came to Germany in '57, I was immersed in the ernste Musik side of the situation, and I went to Darmstadt. I could mention I was a undergraduate student at Harvard, and I had a very, very intelligent friend, Frederick Szewski, who is still a lifelong friend. And he was very filled with intellectual curiosity, and he would order the latest scores from Europe, and they would arrive in Cambridge, Massachusetts, whereas our professors in the music department at Harvard could care less. They were absolutely uninterested in what might be going on in Europe. So it was from Frederick that I first got to look at the scores of Pierre Boulez and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. And Frederick went to Darmstadt, I think in '56, and I believe he met Dieter Schnabel then, or during those years. He suggested that I go to Darmstadt, so I went in '57. But I wasn't a student, and I didn't know a word of German, and I went there, and all the discussions went over my head. So then I went back to college, and I studied some German, and I came back in '59 and enrolled in Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's composition class. Typical of the '50s, all the students, with one exception, were men. And there were two Americans, the rest were Europeans. The two Americans were Lamont Young and myself. And those were the years when the Darmstadt composers were very narrowly focused on on picking up the tradition of the Viennese composers, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, especially Webern. And they were starting up. It was as though they were starting up again from zero, I think, after the horrific experiences of the Third Reich year. It was as though society was being started up again from scratch. But it was also a rather narrow viewpoint. And in those days, in the 50s, this was not only true in Europe, but in the States too. If you studied music, you were studying with somebody who said there's just one way to go, and everything else is either not worth paying attention to or wrong. And that was more or less the situation at Darmstadt, although I'm oversimplifying a bit. So in Stockhausen's class, he was, for me, a very inspiring figure. He talked a lot about dodecaphonic technique. Total serialism was what they were after in those days, which meant expanding what Webern, Berg, and Schoenberg had done, which was to get rid of tonality by fixing the order of the 12 tones. In the 50s in Darmstadt, the idea was to expand that to other aspects of music, timbre and form and dynamics. So you would arrive at a style which was sort of as though you put music into a blender. Not to say that there were not some very wonderful pieces of music written in that time. Well, one wonderful thing about that class was that the American pianist David Tudor was there as Stockhausen's assistant. And his role in the class was to demonstrate new piano music and also to play the music by the faculty and the students. I'll just go through some of the faculty there. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, at that time in '59, the faculty there was hardly older than the students. They were in their early 30s. Henri Pousseur was a wonderful man from Brussels, and he also made serial music. And after Darmstadt, I went to Brussels to work with him as an assistant and sort of a student. And he helped me do an initial work in a small independent electronic music studio in Brussels called Appalac. In those days, there were no standard electronic music studios. Every studio that was set up was different. And in general, the equipment consisted of test instruments, oscillators, and then there was usually an engineer who would build a few special things. So there were filters and ring modulators, oscillators, and tape delays. And the working in those studios had a lot to do with cutting up tape and putting it back together in different forms. To go further here, that was Mauricio Kagel, who was on the faculty at Darmstadt, and he was a native of South America. He had moved to Cologne a couple of years before. And actually, he was not so dodecaphonic. He was doing theatrical pieces that were more direct in their nature. That image, I hadn't seen it in about 45 years. I remember seeing this when I was there in Darmstadt. And then it vanished, and then it reappeared on the web 2 nights ago, which is the way things are now. It shows the friendship between those two, John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. They were friends. They influenced each other. They liked each other. And Stockhausen talked a lot about Cage in that class in 1959. Cage had been there the year before, in 1958, and had made a big impression. And he had been there with David Tudor. So in '59, he wasn't there, but Tudor was there. And that's David Tudor when he was young at a piano, and it looks like he had some sort of a loudspeaker there. But he was the most fantastic pianist in those years in the 50s. I first heard him perform at Harvard, actually. We had a music club and we invited him, and he came for a very tiny fee and gave an amazing concert. But he had been to Black Mountain College with Cage, Cunningham, and the others. He early on developed a technique where he could play every cubic inch of the piano, not just the keyboards. And later on, of course, his career took a very amazing turn when he became a very strong pioneer of homemade analog electronic music. This is what Amy Beale wrote about David Tudor. Almost single-handedly, and within a remarkably short amount of time, Tudor contributed to West Germany's gradual acceptance of unconventional music from the United States through his authoritative and highly respected presence at key new music venues, as well as through his active recording career. Since I'm the only fellow here now who's in music, I thought I should try to sprinkle as much music as possible through this lecture. So I would like to play a piece of music, but I'm going to make brief excerpts of some of the pieces. This is about the last 60 seconds of the piece that I made in that Stockhausen class in 1959. David Tudor and Christoph Kaskel premiered it at the end of the session. Christoph Kaskel was a wonderful percussionist from Cologne. And they liked the piece and they played it a number of times over the next 2 years. And I've always thought of that, making that piece and those performances as the start of my quote-unquote career as a composer. Somehow it seemed that was a sign of something. Anyway, I will play about the last minute of that piece, which shows something about what was in style at Darmstadt then. To talk about the horizons that were narrow in those days. One extreme statement by Pierre Boulez from the late 40s, he must have been very young then, quoted by the New York Times recently, was this, quote, "If a composer has not experienced the necessity of dodecaphonic technique, he is useless." And a few months ago in September in Venice, I met Nuria Schoenberg-Nono, the daughter of Arnold Schoenberg and the widow of Luigi Nono. And we reminisced about Darmstadt in the early years because she and Luigi Nono were there when I was there, although I didn't really know them then. But she told me that there had been some heated discussions among Luigi Nono and some of the other faculty. And the issues had to do with how important tradition was and what attitude to have towards John Cage's use of chants. And Luigi Nono was more or less on one side and the others were on the other side. And Nuria told me that after that, she and Luigi would walk into the room where the other faculty was, and they would turn away from her. They would refuse to greet the two of them. It is so incredible now to think of that. Yeah, then after Darmstadt, I went to Cologne. I was on a fellowship, so I had a year to spend in Europe. And I went first to Brussels and then to Cologne in the winter, and I spent some time with Maurizio Kagel, who was living there. And I remember he told me that he felt that if you lived in a country that was far away from the centers of culture, you had a better chance of having a creative life as an artist. And I thought, he was thinking of South America, but I thought that could be applied to the States too. If you think of culture coming from either Europe or Asia. Yes. But I think that is probably true, and it's hard to imagine that the great American innovators such as Charles Ives, Henry Cowell, Ruth Crawford, Harry Partch, John Cage, could have done what they did if they were living in Europe, in Northern Europe. One day that winter in Cologne, I drove together with Kagel and his wife, Ush, to Essen to hear a performance by Cage and Tudor at the America House there. And they played an early version of Cage's piece, Cartridge Music. Cartridge music used sound materials that were really brand new then. It was the extreme amplification of little tiny sounds. And that had not been possible. It had not been possible to enter that world of music until the inexpensive electronics of this was the beginning of the 60s, until those inexpensive electronics were available. Contact mics and cartridges. The cartridges were the thing that holds the needle in a record player, a 78 record player at that time. So that concert was so different from what I had been hearing for the previous 8 months in Europe. The European pieces tended to be sort of like complicated machinery. They were very complex and demanded a great deal of precision and virtuosity from the performers. Whereas Cage and Tudor were doing something completely different. Part of the idea of that piece is congestion, that you have these materials, you make scores out of them, and the two scores might tell you to go to the same cartridge at the same moment. Then you're in a situation of congestion. You can't do that. So it was just a completely different attitude towards how to make music in real time. And also there was a very humorous contrast between the concert attire of those two. They wore black suits, white shirts, dark ties, polished black shoes. But to perform the piece, Tudor would sometimes crawl on the floor under the piano to make sounds under the soundboard. So I thought I would play a recording of that piece, Cartridge Music, that was made much later, but it was performed, this recording was performed by David Tudor and Kosugi and a third musician, Michael Pugliese. So it's an authentic version of the piece. But the trouble with making brief excerpts of audio is that the experience doesn't come through from just the sound. You really had to be there. Watching those two perform was something. It had humor that was sort of like Buster Keaton. And of course, that doesn't come through from the audio. But anyway, I will play this if I can find it. Oh, that's Luigi Nono. This has to be loud, actually. Well, as I say, you had to be there. So in the decade that followed, the 60s, other American composer-performers began having an impact in Europe as well. Besides Cage, there were the other three members of the so-called New York School: Earl Brown, Christian Wolff, and Morton Feldman. And then there were others, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Pauline Oliveros, Lamont Young, John Gibson, and my friends in the Sonic Arts Union, Alvin Lucier, Gordon Mumma, Robert Ashley. And there were the members of a group of Americans in Rome, mostly Americans in Rome, Musica Electronica Viva, Alvin Karan, Frederick Shevsky, Richard Teitelbaum, and Barbara Mayfield, and some others. Well, I thought I'd like to play another example to bring out the variety in American experimental music in the late 50s and early 60s. Terry Riley, who was a huge influence on me in those years because his music just seemed coming from a different universe from what I had been studying, composed his famous work in C in the early 60s. He and I produced the first recording of that work for Columbia Records in 1968. And since then, the piece has kind of filtered throughout the world and has been performed many, many times. For some people in this room, I know it's already old hat, but for others, you may not know it. And a few years ago, I got a cassette of In C performed in Shanghai on Chinese instruments, which was quite beautiful. And then I was looking around for a recording of In C on the internet the other day, and I came upon a performance in Bamako, Mali, using African instruments. And I thought I would play the first several minutes of that. Oh, maybe it's the next slide. The feeling of that piece, it has energy, but it's also relaxed. And it's because there's no synchronicity in the directions of how to play it. There's just one part that everybody plays. There's a pulse keeper who keeps the steady beat. But no one tells you where the downbeats are. It's notated rhythmically, but where you put the downbeats and when and how fast you advance from one phrase to the next is up to you. So it's like a kind of a cloud that spreads across the piece. And as this is just the beginning, but the tonalities change, and they change in a kind of a distributed way because the different players don't all change at the same time. So it seems like it's a very beautiful model of how music might be made. I'm tempted to skip around here a little bit because this being the 30th anniversary of Music with Memory, I wanted to play some music from that, but maybe I'll approach it gradually. My experience of coming to Europe with my friends as performing musicians, it happened through the Sonic Arts Union. The four of us, Ashley, Gordon Moma, Lucier, and I, we got together and we liked playing together, so we made several tours to Europe. The first one was in 1967, and we had the name Sonic Arts Group at first, and then we changed it to Union because we were not in fact a group. We didn't do group pieces. It was more like an anthology. Each of us would do a piece, and we would help each other with our pieces. So it was, each concert would have typically 4 pieces with 4 personalities. Our work was controversial when we came to Europe. The first concert we gave was in Athens in 1967 in the spring, and there were the audience was shouting things from the back of the hall, and we didn't know Greek. But one of us, Bob Ashley's wife at that time, Mary, was Greek, and we asked her, "What are they saying?" And she said, "Oh, they're yelling the word donkey." And then from there we went to Rome. We gave a concert in Rome, and then we went to Brussels. And in Brussels we gave a concert, and the next day a review appeared in one of the French language newspapers. And I was the one who knew a bit of French, so I read the review and I translated it for my friends. And there's one phrase in that review has remained with me all these 39 years. And that phrase was, "Does one applaud the dentist's drill?" But we kept going, and then a couple of years later we went to Zagreb. There was a spring music festival in Zagreb. We talked to the producer, and he said he wanted to invite a group that would stir things up. And let's see where this is. Bob Ashley did a piece of his called "The Wolfman." That was a page from the magazine Source, which was made in 1968. And one of the types of music that was new then in the early 60s was feedback. Until high fidelity and good microphones and good amplifiers, musicians couldn't work with this thing, feedback, so it was new. And some of you might remember there was a famous piece that Jimi Hendrix played at Woodstock where he used feedback in a most amazing way, probably. So Ashley's piece had to be very loud because otherwise the feedback wouldn't work. And it was actually, it wasn't, the point was not to make it loud, but the point was to do certain things with the formants of the vocalization having to do with how you hold your mouth as you sing. Well, the audience was not happy in Zagreb. They got very angry and they started throwing chairs at us. So, but we survived that too. In Europe, that made us think that in Europe, audiences tended to be very passionate about music. And more typical in the States, if an audience doesn't like something, they would probably just walk out. But in Europe, of course, that tradition goes back, the premiere of the Sacre de Printemps, et cetera, of making riots when things go wrong. So during those years, Sonic Arts, we all had jobs and we were not living in the same place, but we got together when we could to make concerts. And we had some small grants from the National Endowment and the New York State Arts Council. But there was only one time that we had an actual commission to make new pieces, and that was from Hans Otte at Radio Bremen. He commissioned the four of us to make 4 pieces. And he invited us to his Pro Musica Nova festival in 1972, along with mostly other Americans, John Cage, David Tudor, Laura Dean, Steve Reich, and English, Gavin Bryars, Cornelius Cardew, Michael Nyman, and others. That is Hans Otte, who was one of the early promoters of experimental American music. When he was young, he had a grant from the American military authorities. This was shortly after 1940. It was in the 40s. He went to Yale and he studied with Hindemith. And apparently he went to a concert by Cage and Tudor and he didn't understand what they were doing. Then he came back to Europe and he became very committed to the idea of helping American experimental music. I think there was a feeling in Europe that the serial way of thinking was kind of coming to a stale place, where it was there were a lot of repetitive concerts of things that sounded too similar to each other. And so that must have been his motivation for getting Americans to come over, Americans who didn't have support in their own country but were doing various things that were of interest. And Radio Bremen was the least well-funded of the West German radio stations. After the war, the Allies had set up a system for German radio, which was the opposite of what was set up in Paris and in London, which was centralized. And in Germany, the system was decentralized. And that was a wonderful thing because it gave the individual directors at the different radio stations the power to make their own decisions. So at certain radio stations, there were things presented that would not have probably gotten by the committee, the central committee. And Hans Otte was the main director at that time who had all kinds of, who gave many commissions to experimental American composers. And that's the poster for Pro Musica Nova. And you can see it was Sonic Arts and Namjoon Pike is there. Stan Vanderbeek, who had been a student at Black Mountain College, an experimental filmmaker. And Steve Reich and so on and so forth. Here we have the dinner menu, the placemat, but without the voice bubbles. So Cage and Tudor had been commissioned to do two pieces that would be performed simultaneously together. Cage's piece was called Muo, and it was based on texts by Henry David Thoreau that had to do with sound and silence. And David Tudor did his version of his piece called Rainforest, which is really one of the most important pieces of the 70s. It really, it's both a performance and an installation. Installation art was something that was very new at that time. So they did this piece simultaneously, and I'll play a little bit of it if I can find it.
The dry leaves flop, the rustling, it seems to a few sit and enjoy the sound of leaves, as it implies a different life and narigel it sways to some my buck at sea grave. Without any order. Good. Oh, right.
That's just an excerpt, of course. It's not such a wonderful thing to play brief excerpts. Many of the strongest American experimental composers, it would just be wrong to play 2-minute excerpts of Marianne Amichet or Phil Niblock or a number of other composers, but I wanted to give you just a feel of that piece. I'd like to play an excerpt from a piece by Bob Ashley. Oh, that's the our program at the Pro Musica Nova. I'd like to play Bob Ashley's piece. He was very interested in texts, and texts combined with electronic music. And this piece of his, in Sarah, Mencken, Christ, and Beethoven, there were men and women. That was the title of a poem by a poet named John Barton Wolgamott, who was not well known at all, but somehow Bob found his published poem and decided he wanted to make a piece. And the piece, the music part, is a collaboration with Paul DeMarinis, who's been in Berlin. Some of you might know him. And Paul did something with synthesizers that was reacting in some way that I can't explain exactly to Bob's voice. But I'll play a little of this.
Good.
its very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven, very heroically, the very cruelly ancestral death of Sarah Paul Howard had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Raphael, Sabatini, George Ade, Margaret Storm, Jameson, Ford, Maddox, Huber, Jean-Jacques Bernard, Louis Brumfield, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, and Ellen Brown Norden very titanically. In her very truly great manners of John Barton Walgamat, very heroically, Ellen Brown Norden had very originally come amongst his very really grand men and women to Lodovico Ariosto, Solon, Matteo, Mario Bahardo, Philo Judeas, Roger Bacon, Longus, Simeon Strunsky, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe very titanically. In their very truly great manners of John Barton Walgamat, very heroically, Thomas Stearns, Eliot Robert Southey, Edward John Morton, Drax Plunkett, Dunsany, Charles Ludwig Dodson, Arthur Schopenhauer, Blaise Pascal, George Morse, Corin Broadus, and Jonathan Swift did very sarcastically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden, very heroically, Walgamat as God had very magnificently come amongst her very really grand men and women to Gaius Plinius Secundus, Bion, Origenes, Adamantius, Democritus, Phidias, Jusus, Pietro Arendino, and Michelangelo Buonarroti very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Johannes Brahms, very heroically, Sarah Paula Hart had very allegorically come amongst his very really grand Clarence Day Jr., John Donne, Ruggiero, Leon Cavallo, James Owen Henney, Gustav Frentzen, Thomas Beer, Joris Karl Huysman, and Franz Peter Schubert very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Willis Siebert Cather very heroically, William Sidney Porter, Lawrence Stern, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Walter Savage Landor, Thomas Gray, Tobias George Smollett, and Helen Brown Norton had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to William Shakespeare very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Wilhelm Richard Wagner very heroically, Sarah Paul Hart had very allegorically come amongst his very really grand men and women.
I'm looking at the clock here, and I don't want this lecture to be too long. And this is the, as you said, Matthias, this is the 30th anniversary of Music with Memory. And thanks to Werner Durand, I have a couple of recordings, and I'd like to play at least one of them. And after that, I also want to play a 6-minute video clip of John Cage in Berlin in 1963, which is quite fascinating. So I think I'll skip ahead to Music with Memory, and if I can find it. Let's see, it should be. There's a way of doing this. I have to skip through things that we didn't get to. primitive computer, by today's standards, the Apple II. And it had various synthesizers and pitch sensors. The computer is trying to play phrases, and the player interrupts it by playing new pitches, and then the computer switches to another phrase. And it was a work that was in progress and turned into another piece called Leap Day Night, which was on a record about a year later. There's one piece, I don't want to take too much time, and there's a quite amazing movie that was made of John Cage and Tudor in Berlin in 1963, which is a question and answer session combined with a lecture, combined with a performance. When Cage was asked to do a lecture, he usually would turn it into a performance. And this just is so expressive of the relationship between experimental American artists and the Berlin public that I think you will be interested in.
Eine andere Frage, die ich an John Cage stellen möchte. Wollen Sie durch die Zufallsmethoden die schöpferische Persönlichkeit ausschalten?
Do you want to eliminate the creative personality through employing your chance methods?
I think our understanding of what creativity is can be changing.
Ich glaube, der Begriff der Schöpfungskraft kann sich ändern.
We have the desire to let people be people and to let sounds be sounds.
Wir haben den Wunsch, Menschen Menschen sein zu lassen und Klänge Klänge.
But we don't think that by freeing sounds from an enslavement to people, that we thereby lose creativity.
Wir glauben aber nicht, dass wir Schöpfungskraft dadurch verlieren, dass wir die Klänge aus einer Art Sklavenschaft befreien.
May I put another question? Herr Cage, ist durch die Herrschaft des Zufalls nicht die Form des Kunstwerks überhaupt abgeschafft? Könnte man nicht einfach einen Ausschnitt aus Geräuschen und Musik eines Jahrmarktes auf Tonband aufnehmen und sagen, das ist ein Stück Komposition?
There is another question now. Is it not possible, because of the domination of chance in your method, that the form of work is completely lost? Couldn't one just record on tape a segment of noises and music of a county fair and say, this is a composition?
Well, such a recording we already count as art when it is in the field of the visual arts rather than of the acoustic arts. For instance, there are few...
Eine solche Aufnahme ist in meinen Augen schon Kunst, wenn zwar auch nicht auf dem optischen, aber so doch, wenn auch nicht auf dem akustischen, aber so doch mehr auf dem optischen Gebiet.
For instance, I don't think any one of us nowadays would say that photography is not an art.
Ich glaube, heutzutage wird keiner von uns mehr glauben, dass eine gute Fotografie bzw. die Fotografie als solche keine Kunst ist.
What has to change is our nature, our understanding of what it is to make something.
Was sich ändern muss, ist unser Verständnis dafür, wie man etwas macht.
I think I might almost change that from make something to do something.
Pardon me, I didn't get that.
I would change it from our idea of making something to our idea of doing something.
Ich würde unsere Ansicht, etwas zu tun, darin ändern, etwas zu machen.
Wir wissen, Mr. Cage, dass Sie sich dem Zen-Buddhismus geistig verbunden haben. Die Zen-Buddhisten, die ich in Japan getroffen habe, stehen fast allen Formen der Kunst sehr skeptisch gegenüber. Mit Ausnahme des Komponisten Toshiro Mayuzumi, der westlich geschult ist, würden die wahrscheinlich mit den Kompositionen und Manifestationen von Ihnen, Mr. Cage, und Ihrer Schule nichts anfangen können.
We know, Mr. Cage, that you are very sympathetic with the Zen Buddhist. The Zen Buddhist, I'm sorry, that I have met in Japan almost exclusively look upon all forms of music very skeptically. With the exception of the composer Toshiro Mayuzumi, who is Western educated, the Zen Buddhist would in all probability not know what to do with the manifestations of your school of music.
No, it's quite true. Just this last fall, I was in Japan.
Das stimmt, ich war gerade letzten Herbst in Japan.
And Mr. Tudor and I gave a concert in Kyoto.
Mr. Tudor und ich haben ein Konzert in Tokio gegeben.
And a Zen monk and some student monks came to our program.
Und ein Zen-Mönch und einige Mönch-Eleven kamen zu unserem Programm.
And some days later, we found ourselves guests overnight in the monastery in which these students and that monk lived.
Und ein paar Tage später waren wir über Nacht Gäste in diesem Kloster, in dem die Mönche leben.
And the monk mentioned to me that he had been at the concert.
Und einer der Mönche erwähnte, dass er bei dem Konzert war.
And he understood nothing.
Und er hat nichts verstanden.
Well, that could be the end of my lecture. I guess if anyone has any comments or questions or discussion points. Yeah.
So, in doing a composition, would there be a score sometimes that, and what would you use for the notation so that if someone wanted to play that composition when you or the other composer wasn't there, they could have an idea? And was the score meant to be, you know, like a Beethoven symphony, you play it this way, or was it meant to be interpreted by the people playing the music?
Are you asking me for my work or?
Yeah, and just the others, Cage, yourself, others,
Yeah.
or maybe it was all different between the two.
Well, there were differences, yeah, but, well, with electronics, it's an issue that's bothered me for a long time, that if it takes some complicated software, or in the case of Tudor, if it took some complicated analog electronics, it couldn't be done unless the composer was there, which radically restricts how many performances you get, of course.
Right.
And now, actually, I'm working with a young musician who is interested in one of my computer pieces. Well, now everyone has these laptops, and he has the software he can put my piece on his laptop.
Oh.
So I'm about to send it to him. But this, yeah, with Cage. With Cage, the music is very clear. It's published and it's on pieces of paper. Some of them are conventional paper with words on them. Some of them are transparencies with symbols that have. laid across one another to make a score, but you can order those scores and then you can perform them. And there's no policeman to determine whether you're doing it well or not. I mean, that's one thing about publishing music. Once it's published, anyone can buy it and can perform it. And but on the other hand, it's not private. So whenever you're working with non-standard means of making music, this is an issue. Yeah. I guess that there could be more to say about it.
I was interested in your account of the piece that you played of yours, where you talked about how the computer was trying to play something, and then the performer interrupted the computer and made kind of the computer recalibrate. And I'm curious in the kind of music that works that way, how much really belongs to the performer? Because, you know, one could make a program and give it to the computer and have the computer perform it. But what you were doing there was very much an interaction between a human and a computer. And so where do you draw the line, or at what point do you choose to go in a more performer direction or a more mechanized direction, and why would you make those choices?
Yeah, well, the answer is the performer has a lot to do with how it comes out. And with the pieces that I've done that are more or less using these techniques, I consider myself not 100% the composer. I'm maybe some lesser percentage. And then who you work with is all important in terms of how it turns out. And but on the other hand, what I like is a situation where, I mean, I've worked with a number of wonderful musicians in these situations with interactive computer things going on, and they think of things to do that I would never have thought of doing that are wonderful. They think of wonderful things to do that surprise me, and that's what I like best. But it's risky because it doesn't always work well. So, yeah.
Much of what you've spoken about tonight has been about performance and about music as a sort of singular event, but I noticed in your biography that you've worked a lot as a producer as well. So how do you work when it's a question of fixing a piece in a recording studio?
Oh yeah, well I love recording studios. I love recording, and but I don't get to do it very often anymore. I mean, the last time I worked on a recording was 5 years ago. There was a multi-record set of called Music for Mirth, which was a collection of a lot of the music that had been made for the Cunningham Company, and it was produced by a group. I was one of the members of the group, and there you have to make all the decisions. This stays on, this goes off, but I like very much working in that way. But it's another thing. Yeah.
Now, David, may I have my manuscript back? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
This was for me. Nothing was old hat. It was just a fascinating evening. Thank you very much.
So much.
Okay.